All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to be really diving into a pretty complex story that's been developing in India. It's basically, a real world example of what happens when you've got these big global tech ambitions meeting the realities of a massive and intricate country. And specifically, we're talking about the various ways Elon Musk's vision is interacting with, India.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study. We're talking about how a global tech leader has to kind of navigate a very specific legal and regulatory landscape, not to mention all the cultural nuances of a market like India. It's a powerful country undergoing a ton of changes and growth.
Right, exactly. And to really get into the weeds here, we're going to be looking at some excerpts from a document dated March 20th, 2025. It does a really solid job of breaking down all these interconnected issues. So our mission for this deep dive, for all of you listening, is to pull out the essential takeaways. We're going to provide a clear overview, highlighting the key tension points, potential outcomes, and just, the big picture significance of it all. We'll try to keep it focused and avoid getting lost in the weeds too much. So why don't we just jump right in? Maybe the best place to start is with what's probably the most talked about aspect of this whole story. Yeah. The standoff between X, formerly Twitter, and the Indian government.
Absolutely. At the core of this standoff is X's legal challenge against Section 793(b) of India's Information Technology Act.
What this section essentially does, and our source material goes into detail here, is that it compels platforms like X to remove content that the government has flagged as unlawful. And X's primary argument is that this process lacks a crucial element: judicial oversight. Okay, so we're not talking about some minor procedural thing here. X is really making a stand on principle. Their stance, as the document highlights, is rooted in the protection of free expression. They see this provision as basically a backdoor to censorship because it potentially allows the government to bypass, the typical judicial review that would normally safeguard these types of content removals. And there's a connection here to legal precedent that seems particularly relevant, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. The document brings up the 2015 Shreya Singhal case, and that's crucial here. That ruling, if you recall, established that under Section 69A of the IT Act, there has to be judicial oversight.
Yeah.
It's necessary when it comes to blocking online content. So what X is arguing is that with Section 7A93, the government is essentially going around those safeguards that the Supreme Court put in place with the Shreya Singhal ruling. They're essentially saying, hold on, we already established the need for checks and balances on this type of power.
Right. And that kind of brings us to the Sahyog portal, which the name, kind of implies collaboration, but in this whole context, it's become a real sticking point. X has flat out refused to participate, and the document actually quotes them, calling it a censorship tool. What's really behind that strong reaction?
Well, the main issue X has with the Sahyog portal seems to be this. They feel pressured to comply with government takedown requests, but without that crucial legal review we were just talking about. They see it as a system where, they might be forced to remove content just because the government says so, without any independent judicial assessment whether that content actually breaks the law.
Right.
And that raises some serious questions about accountability and, the potential for the government to overreach.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the potential fallout from this legal battle. What could we be looking at depending on who comes out on top?
So if X wins this case, one of the key takeaways might be a shift in the power dynamic between the Indian government and, global tech platforms when it comes to content moderation. It could set a pretty significant precedent for more platform autonomy. We might even see a more clearly defined framework for what constitutes online free expression in India, one that puts a lot of emphasis on the courts having oversight over content regulation.
Okay, and on the flip side, what if the Indian government wins this legal challenge? What are the implications there?
The analysis in our document suggests that if that happens, we could see a tightening of digital content regulations within India. That could mean a bigger compliance burden for all the global tech companies operating there. It might even make India a less attractive market for investments and expansion. Essentially, it would signal a pretty clear message that the government intends to firmly control the digital space.
So for those of you following along at home, what's the real core issue that this whole legal battle highlights?
Well, I think it really boils down to this. How do you balance a nation's right to govern its own digital space with the global principles of free speech? In our world today, everything is so interconnected digitally. It's a tension that a lot of countries are grappling with. And this situation in India, it's a pretty high-profile example of that struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've spent some time on this legal situation with X, which is obviously a big deal. But Our source material points out, Elon Musk's ambitions in India, they go way beyond social media. We've also got to consider his plans for Tesla and Starlink.
Right. While the X case is getting a lot of attention right now, Musk clearly sees India as a major market for his electric vehicles and satellite internet services. Long term, these ventures have the potential to be huge for India, both in terms of economic growth and technological advancement.
Let's start with Tesla. It feels like there's been talk about Tesla potentially entering the Indian market for years. What's the latest on that front? What's our source saying?
Well, the document confirms that there's been a lot of anticipation around Tesla's potential move into India for years, and they've been actively exploring different states as potential locations for a manufacturing facility. Specifically, it mentions Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Gujarat. And the logic there is that those states already have well-established automotive ecosystems, so it would be a natural fit for Tesla in terms of infrastructure and supply chains.
Right, so it's not just about finding a spot on the map. The document also mentions Tesla's actually hiring people in India.
Exactly. Tesla's hiring efforts in India are a pretty clear sign. They're serious about setting up shop there. They're building teams to manage all aspects of their business in the country, from sales and customer support to, broader business functions. It shows real commitment to establishing a long-term presence in the Indian market.
Now, one of the biggest points of contention when it comes to Tesla in India has always been, those import tariffs on electric vehicles. Does the document offer any insight into that issue?
It does. The document really highlights Musk's argument that the high import duties on electric vehicles in India are basically pricing Tesla's cars out of reach for a lot of people. He's saying that these taxes are a major roadblock to wider adoption of EVs.
And if those tariffs were to be lowered, what kind of impact could that have? Not just for Tesla, but for India's overall sustainability goals as well.
Well, reducing those tariffs could be huge. For Tesla, it would obviously make their cars more competitive and probably lead to a big jump in sales. But more broadly, it could really kickstart India's electric vehicle market in a significant way.
Yeah.
More people would be able to afford EVs, which would contribute to the country's efforts to, reduce its carbon footprint.
Okay, so Tesla is focused on, transforming transportation. Now let's shift gears to Starlink and its potential to kind of revolutionize internet access across India.
What's especially interesting about Starlink is its aim to tackle India's digital divide head-on. You see, our source material really emphasizes that a lot of rural and remote areas in India still don't have access to reliable high-speed internet. And that's exactly the kind of connectivity Starlink wants to provide, using its network of low Earth orbit satellites.
Okay, low Earth orbit satellites, that sounds pretty high-tech. How does that actually translate to better internet for people on the ground?
Well, because these satellites are orbiting much closer to Earth than traditional, geostationary satellites, they can offer lower latency, which means faster speeds, basically. So things like video conferencing, online education, even just general web browsing, all that stuff becomes much more doable in places where, traditional internet infrastructure is either non-existent or really unreliable.
And it doesn't sound like Starlink is planning to go it alone in India either. The document mentions some partnerships with major telecom companies there.
Right. Those partnerships with companies like Bharti Airtel and Reliance Jio, they're going to be key for Starlink's rollout in India. Those local players already have a ton of infrastructure and market reach, which can really help Starlink navigate all the complexities of doing business in India. Plus, it helps them extend their services to a much wider customer base.
So we've got this ongoing legal battle with X happening at the same time as these big expansion plans for Tesla and Starlink. Do you think those things could be connected? Could the issues with the government over X create some headwinds for Tesla and Starlink?
Yeah, that's a really sharp question. And the document definitely suggests that it's a real possibility. If there's already this friction between X and the Indian government, it stands to reason that the government might be less willing to, say, fast-track approvals for Tesla and Starlink, or, offer them favorable regulatory treatments. Like, even if the specific issues are different, you've got this underlying tension with the same parent company. So we could potentially see delays in getting permits, or just more scrutiny overall in areas where they need the government's cooperation, like setting up Tesla factories or expanding Starlink's satellite internet services.
On the other hand, could a win for X in that lawsuit actually end up helping Tesla and Starlink in the long run?
Oh, for sure. The document definitely raises that possibility. Think about it. If X wins a case that strengthens protections for free speech and promotes more transparency in how the government regulates online platforms, that could generate a lot of goodwill among India's tech-savvy population. It might signal a shift towards a more predictable, more investor-friendly policy environment overall. And that could, in turn, make India a much more attractive market for Tesla and Starlink's innovations, potentially leading to, smoother operations and even more government support down the line.
It's a fascinating web of interconnected factors. All right, let's zoom out a little bit and consider how Musk's ventures kind of fit into India's broader national objectives. The document talks about this in terms of sustainability and, technological progress.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting. India has some big goals when it comes to things like reducing carbon emissions and promoting domestic manufacturing. They even have an initiative called Make in India. And Tesla's entry into the market really aligns with those goals.
In what ways specifically? Can you flesh that out a bit?
Sure. So Tesla's electric vehicles, they directly contribute to reducing emissions in the transportation sector. That's obviously a huge part of India's efforts to mitigate climate change. Then there's the Make in India initiative. If Tesla sets up manufacturing plants in India, as planned, that directly supports that campaign by creating jobs and boosting India's manufacturing capabilities, particularly in green tech, which is obviously a booming sector. Oh, and the document also brought up Tesla's supercharger network. That could be another interesting area of collaboration. Tesla's expertise could potentially help India develop a robust charging infrastructure, which is really crucial for EV adoption to take off in a big way.
But the document also points out that there are some challenges for Tesla in fully realizing this alignment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Beyond the import tariffs we talked about earlier, India has a lot of work to do in terms of infrastructure, especially when it comes to building out a reliable charging network for electric vehicles. Plus, Tesla's going to face competition from domestic manufacturers in India, companies like Tata Motors. They're already making and selling their own EV models designed specifically for the Indian market.
Okay, so now let's look at Starlink through the lens of India's broader goals, particularly the Digital India initiative.
Starlink's focus on bringing internet connectivity to those rural and underserved areas, it ties in perfectly with India's Digital India initiative. The whole point of that initiative is to bridge the digital divide and make sure everyone in India has access to online services. The document explains how Starlink's technology has the potential to reach places where traditional internet infrastructure is just too expensive or difficult to build. And that could be a game changer for education, healthcare, and economic development in those communities.
So Starlink could really be a catalyst for change in those remote areas, but are there similar challenges for them when it comes to aligning with India's goals?
Definitely. The document points out that Starlink will have to deal with a lot of regulatory hurdles to get approval for its satellite operations in India. Those processes can be pretty complex and take a long time.
Yeah.
Then there's the issue of affordability. Starlink might offer high-speed internet, but if it's too expensive for the rural populations they're targeting, it's not going to be very effective. And just like Tesla, they'll be facing competition from established internet service providers in India.
So it sounds like for both Tesla and Starlink to truly succeed in India and really contribute to the country's goals, they're going to have to be very strategic. They'll need to carefully navigate all those regulations, build strong partnerships with both the government and the private sector, and make sure their technologies are affordable for the average Indian consumer.
Exactly. India is a huge opportunity for both Tesla and Starlink, and their core goals are very much in line with India's national objectives. But to make it work, they're going to need to be really proactive in addressing those challenges.
All right, so let's take a step back and kind of put it all together.
Yeah.
We've been exploring this, really interesting and often kind of tense relationship between Elon Musk's various ventures and India. We've looked at this legal battle over online freedom with X, the ambitious plans to bring Tesla's EVs and Starlink's internet services to the country, and the potential for all of that to contribute to India's development goals. Of course, we also talked about the challenges they're facing.
Yeah, and what's really striking is how interconnected all of these different threads are.
Yeah.
What happens with the X lawsuit could have a real impact on how Tesla and Starlink are able to do business in India. It really underscores how important these regulatory and political factors are when it comes to technological advancement, especially in a massive global market like India.
Absolutely. So, as all of you listening are thinking about this, about the legal battles, the promises of these new technologies, and India's ambitions, it really raises some big questions. Looking at how intertwined these events are, what does this whole situation tell us about the future of global tech regulation? How are these major emerging economies going to find that balance between encouraging innovation and protecting their own national interests? And what could all of this mean for India's future in the tech world and its role on the global stage as things continue to develop? It's a really fascinating situation to keep an eye on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.